So instead of focusing on the Torah portion this week of Bamidbar, which is a wonderful parsha, and I hope you'll get to study it in depth. Today, I want to talk about today, the unique nature of today in Jewish history, right? So it is well known that this coming weekend, we're going to celebrate Shavuos, Motzei Shabbos. After Shabbos, we go straight from Shabbos into Shavuos, in which we celebrate the receiving of the Torah. Over here, we have a wonderful program of all-night Torah study, but unfortunately, it will not be broadcast on Zoom. If anybody wants to fly in for the holiday, you can join us for 12:30 to 4:30 a.m. Torah study, followed by the festivities of Sunday. And so we know about that. We know about Shavuos being the 6th, the 7th of Siva. Today, though, is the second day of Siva. And off the cuff, the second day of Siva does not seem to be a festive day at all. In fact, I'm going to guess that most people, if you ask, what happened on the second day of Sivan, they'll say nothing that I'm aware of. But as it turns out, the second day of Sivan is the day on which a very profound statement was made, and it really crystallized a lot of what it means to be Jewish. So on the first day of Sivan, Rosh Chodesh Sivan, which was yesterday, that is the anniversary of the day that the Jewish people arrived at Sinai. And let's share the screen. I'm going to share the screen of the events as they transpired leading up to the giving of Torah. So you're looking at Exodus chapter 19, verse number 1. Okay. B'chodesh hashlishi, it was in the third month, l'tzeis b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim, when the Jewish people left the third month of them leaving Egypt, Bayom Hazeh, on this day, Ba'u Midbar Sinai, they arrived at Mount Sinai. The third month of the departure from Egypt, on this day they arrived at Sinai. Says the Rashi, what if you want to know what day it was? It just says the month, but you don't know which day it is. So Rashi says it does allude to which day it is, because it says Bayom Hazeh, on this day. Those words are unnecessary. Says Rashi, on this day, Rosh Chodesh. That was on Rosh Chodesh. And Rashi says, it could have just said on that day. On that day, it would have been the more logical wording to use. When it says on this day they arrived, on this day is a reference to Rosh Chodesh. And by saying on this day, there's another message being conveyed. And that is that every day one should imagine, one should see the Torah having been given to them on that day. So Bayom Hazeh, on this day, teaches the very important and perhaps difficult quality, the important yet difficult quality, which is to see the Torah as brand new and not a document which is very old, but rather a brand new document. So that is the idea of Bayom Hazeh. Now, that was Rosh Chodesh. The next verse tells us another very important quality. Each one of these verses contains so much more than what it seems like at first glance. Verse number 2, Vayisu Refidim, they traveled from Refidim, Vayavo Midbar Sinai, and they arrived at the desert of Sinai. Vayachanu Bamidbar, and they encamped by the mountain. Vayichan Shem Yisrael neged Har, and Israel camped opposite the mountain. So again, at first glance, this seems to be a simple verse. They left Refidim, they arrived at Sinai, and they camped by the mountain. However, the sages point out that within this verse, there is a very beautiful idea. And that is the words Vayichan Sham. Vayichan Sham in English would mean, and he camped. And he camped by the mountain. So the commentaries say, what do you mean, and he camped? It should be, and they camped. In fact, all through the verse, it says Vayisu, and they traveled, Vayavau, and they arrived, Vayachanu, and they camped. Suddenly, Vayichan, and he. Why is the wording changed to be individual? Vayichan Sham. Says the Talmud that because at that moment, when they arrived at Sinai, they experienced a oneness. They experience a oneness that they never had beforehand and they never had afterwards. And that's why it says Vayichan Sham and he, because they were like one being at that point. The wording of the Talmud famously is Ki ish echad belev echad, like one person with one heart. So we have two verses, and each verse shares with us a profound idea that we should try to pursue. Verse number 1 says, Bayom hazeh, on this day, a person should try to imagine having received the Torah every single day as if it's brand new today, a brand new gift today. Verse number 2, Vayichan Sham, tells us of the quality of unity which we are meant to pursue, a unity in which we are one with one heart and one like one person with one heart. And that was a necessary prerequisite for the giving of Torah. What's interesting is that we see that unity is the prerequisite to prayer. That's why we start the prayers, at least in the Chabad tradition. We start the prayers with Hareini Mikabel Alai, I accept upon myself the mitzvah of Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, the love of your fellow as yourself. We say that before prayer. And here we have that the unity that existed between the Jewish people was a necessary prerequisite for the giving of Torah. So both prayer and Torah rely on unity between one another beforehand. So that is the second verse. But all this took place on the first of Sivan, which was yesterday. Rosh Chodesh Sivan was yesterday. The next verse takes us to day number 2 of Sivan. This verse number 3 already refers to the day number 2 of Sivan, which is today. So today is the anniversary of what we're about to read. Moshe Allah El HaElokim. And Moshe ascends to God. Rashi immediately tells us what day was that? By Yom HaSheni. On the second day is when Moshe ascends to heaven. So that's today. Vayikra Elav Hashem min hahar lemar. And God says to God calls out. And God calls out to from the mountain to say, Kosomar lebeis Yaakov v'tagid livnei Yisrael. So shall you say to the house of Jacob and tell the people of Israel. Okay, so again, it's another verse where at first glance, there doesn't seem to be much to focus on, right? This is a preface to something. But if you look a little more closely, you'll notice here too, there's a very profound idea. It's really incredible how these verses, you can read through them very quickly and totally miss some of the very beautiful, deeper messages being conveyed. What's the deeper message in this verse? Seems to be simple. Moshe went up to the mountain. God calls out and says, go tell the Jewish people something. Seems to be as simple as can be. And yet, the sages tell us, why does God say, speak to the house of Jacob and to the people of Israel? Why do you need to say that both? Isn't that the same thing? Isn't the house of Jacob and the people of Israel the same thing? And why would God tell Moshe, speak to just extra words? Just to either say, Ko Somer lebeis Yaakov, either say, go speak to the house of Jacob, or say, Tagei livnei Yisrael, speak to the children of Israel. Talmud tells us it's actually two different groups. It's two different groups that God was commanding Moshe to speak to. Beis Yaakov, the house of Jacob, refers to the women. And the children of Israel refers to the men. So God tells Moshe, I want you to speak to the women and I want you to speak to the men. And he kind of separates between the two. First speak to the women and then speak to the men. And there's two messages here. Firstly, the wording is different. Kotomar, so shall you say to the house of Jacob, that's the women, Vitaged, and tell Livnei Yisrael, the people of Israel. What's the difference between Tomar and Taged? What's the difference between Amira and Magid? Both seem to be the same thing. Go tell them. But those who are familiar with diktuk, with the more nuanced details within the words and with the Hebrew language, will know that Tomar, Amira, is more soft-spoken. Haggadah, Taged, Vayaged is more severe. Taged is more severe. Tomar is more gentle. So the first thing God is telling him is that when you speak to the women, it should be with a certain element of gentleness. There should be a more gentler speech when speaking to the women of the Jewish people, even if you're conveying the same message, but it should be with a gentle format. And Tagei L'bnei Yisrael, when you speak to the men of Israel, there should be more severity, more discipline, more command. So that's the first thing God is saying. Speak to the two different groups within the Jewish people, the men and the women, but don't speak to them the same way. To the women, it should be a more gentle conversation. With the men, it should be a more severe, more severe conversation. And the second thing that we see from here is that he was first commanded to speak to the women and then to the men. Why? Why speak to the women first and then to the men? Why not the men first and then the women? Especially if you consider that men actually have more obligations in Torah than women do. Men have more requirements of mitzvahs than women do. So perhaps it would make sense to start with the men, where there's a greater sense of obligation, and then move on to the women who have a lesser obligation. What is the reason for this? So I'll share from one of the commentaries. And that is in the Sefer Shemois Rabbah, the commentary on the Medrash, the great Torah commentary, the Bachai, says, the reason God told Moshe to speak to the women first were because the women are more important for the continuity of Torah and mitzvahs. Because the woman is the more determining factor for the Torah observance of a home and the Torah observance of a family and the continued Torah observance of the children. Because a woman has more natural connection to her children in many different ways, starting from birth. Right at birth, a child has a more natural need for the mother, and therefore that creates a certain connection. Nothing against fathers. But as he's saying over here, the fact of the matter is that a child is more likely to follow the path that the mother paves for him than the father. Obviously, in a healthy family dynamic, the father and the mother are both sharing the same message, right? What's the line? There was a couple who were talking to each other, and the wife, was talking to her husband about their children. She said to her husband, she says, I think it's important that our children hear one voice. And the husband nods. And she says, and I think that voice should be mine. So ideally, husband and wife should both share the same message. But the Bachai says that God understood that the more important of the two, the father and the mother, the woman or the man, as far as the continuity of Judaism, is the women. And for that reason, God says to Moshe, first speak to the women and then move on and share the same idea to the men. If the women accept the Torah, then we can be certain that the future is bright for the Jewish people. But if the men accept it and the women don't, then there is no future of Judaism. Just share a couple more minutes. And all this happened today. But I want to share the next couple of verses. Not going to get into Rashi. But verse number 4, what is the message that Moshe conveyed to the Jewish people on the second day of Siva, today? Atem re'isem, you have seen, asher asisi l'Mitzrayim, that which I have done to Egypt. Va'esa eschem al kanfei nisharim, and I carried you on the wings of eagles. Va'avi eschem Eloi, and I brought you to me. You saw that I took you out of Mitzrayim. I carried you on the wings of eagles, and I brought you to me here at Sinai. And then he says, and Rashi here is fascinating, but I just want to get to the text of the verse. Va'ata, and now, says God, Im shamoa tishmu bikoli, if you listen to my voice, ushmartem es brisi, and you shall keep my covenant, vehayisem li segula mikol ha'amim, and you will be for me a treasure of all peoples. Kili kol haaretz, because the entire land is mine. Verse number 6, Va'atem tihiyu li mamleches kohanim, and you shall be for me a kingdom of priests, of princes, the Goy Kadosh, and a holy nation. Eila hadvarim, these are the words, Asher tidaber al bnei Yisrael, which you should speak to the Jewish people. Because of these words, what is God saying? God's saying, if you listen to my voice and you observe my covenant, you will be for me a treasure from among the other nations. And it's simply put, God is saying, this is where, when we talk about the terminology, the chosen people, which some Jews are uncomfortable with that term. How can we consider anyone to be chosen over anyone else? After all, are all humans children of God? The answer is yes. All humans are children of God, all created in the image of God. But in this verse, God makes it very clear that when a Jew chooses to follow in the covenant of God and observe the commandments, there is something chosen. There's something unique about the Jewish people. For this reason, this day, this second day of Sivan, which is today, is called Yom HaMiyuchas, the day of Yichas, the day in which the Jewish people receive their lineage. This day, more than any other day in the year, do we have a clear statement from God, which says that the Jewish people, when they choose to follow in the ways of Hashem, are a unique treasure to God. Let's read Segula, the Rashi of Segula. V'yisim li Segula. What does Segula mean? Says Rashi, Segula, Otsar Chaviv, a beloved treasure. Like the treasures of the kings, costly vessels, precious stones, so will you be a treasure to me than the nations. Now, God says, it's not only that you are mine, all of the world is mine, all the nations are mine, but there is a unique treasure that the Jewish people are and become when they choose to observe the Torah commandments. And obviously, any person can choose to be part of that treasure. That's the other point, is that Judaism doesn't say that no one else can join and be part of this treasure. Anyone who chooses can opt in and join the Jewish nation and be part of this treasure, assuming that they follow in the path of God. But it's not to be misunderstood. You hear sometimes you'll hear ideas out there that all nations are the same and all forms of worship are the same, because it's a pleasant idea to say. It's pleasant to say that everyone is the same, but the Jewish belief is not that way. The Jewish belief is, yes, all human beings are created in the image of God and God loves them all. But when a Jew chooses to observe the Torah's commandments, when a person embraces the covenant of God, God says there is a treasure that descends, there is a certain treasure of that identity that doesn't exist anywhere else. Now, because of this, the Jewish people have suffered. The Talmud tells us that why is it that the mountain we receive the Torah on is called Sinai? Why Mount Sinai? Why not another name? So the answer given is because Sinai is very closely related to the Hebrew word sina, which means hatred. And the idea given is that when we receive the Torah at Sinai, we also receive the hatred in the eyes of the world. And that's been that way for 3,000 years. And it's because of this. The reason, everyone, there's the question of why do they hate us? Why is anti-Semitism the oldest and most consistent hatred in human history? And part of it is this verse right here, is because God said that a Jew who chooses to observe the commandments, God says you will be a precious treasure. And the nations of the world were not happy about this, understandably. Some who saw this said, okay, I want in, I'm ready to join. And those were welcomed with open hands. And you even have the idea of righteous among the nations. Even if they're not Jewish, you can be a righteous, godly person among the nations. But there is these words which are both powerful and came with a price. And this happened today. And this is why today, the second day of Sivan, is known as Yom HaMiyuchas, is basically the day in which Jewish people were given their identity. God clarified what is the Jewish identity. 4 days later, we received the Torah. And that's when God, this pasuk, God says, if you commit to what I'm going to give you in a few days from now, you will be my treasure. 5 days later, they received that Torah. They received exactly what it is that God wants from them. And over the course of the next period in time, Moshe gave them all of the Torah. But it was today in which God gave them their identity. So in many ways, a huge part of the identity of Judaism was given to us today on the second day of Sivan, the second day of the third month of the year. So it is a very special day. All right, I'm going to stop here. Obviously, today, tomorrow, all the next few days, we are preparing ourselves for the receiving of the Torah, the greatest gift ever. And we celebrate it on Shavuos, but we prepare ourselves, even in the desert. Jewish people have to prepare for 3 days. So those 3 days preparations begins tonight. Tonight begins the Shlosha Simei Hagbala, the 3 days of preparation leading up to the giving of Torah. And so therefore, because we believe that every year the events transpire again, so it means tonight is another important step towards receiving the Torah as we enter the 3 days of preparation for receiving the Torah at Sinai. So I wish you all a very good Yom Tov, and Kabbalah Satorah B'Simcha B'Pnimius, may you merit to receive the Torah joyously and internally, internalize the messages, joyously internalize the messages, and a good Yom Tov to all of you. Thank you for joining.